Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, a registered social worker and therapist in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 13 years in social work and 5 years as a therapist. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the black sheep within the family who can be considered the scapegoat. And I have been studying more of Carl Jung, and his understanding is the notion of the collective unconscious. Carl Jung understood the collective unconscious. So that's a shared subconscious that we all share as humanity. And so these are like the collective unconscious or the collective archetypes, shared meaning within the collective subconscious, and makes up our part of our human nature as part of our awareness and our consciousness. And so these early archetypes, or what shapes the subconscious mind. So we have our personal subconscious and the collective subconscious. Jung believed that the family, especially more unconscious and not aware of the collective unconscious, they reenact these roles within the family unit. Think about the unconditional caring mother, so that a mother that devotes all of her energy and time to being the loving, caring, unconditional, giving mother. So she's playing out an archetype. Then you could have the king, and that perhaps could be the father, and perhaps even the oldest brother, if there's an older brother in the family, or the queen, if it's an older sister, or a princess. The notion is that the family plays out these roles and they're co-created. So that's actually a key point too, because you can obviously think with the scapegoat role or the black sheep that it's entirely was the family projecting onto the child. And it is in some sense, but it's also important to know that the child considered the scapegoat or black sheep. So perhaps growing up they were like the creative type or the kind of a curious child, and could be smart and just very sensitive as well maybe. But they can probably maybe be considered weird or just different from the family that wants control or order. And so they are seen as a threat, or there's some suspicion from very early. They're ones that often carry consciousness and have more awareness. And so they're, from a very young age, in some sense, a threat also to the equilibrium to the family. So according to Jung, these roles are reflective of the collective unconscious. And one main aspect is the notion of shadow. And also there's a notion of a collective shadow. So within a family, especially if they're more dysfunctional or the parents are emotionally immature or narcissistic, then the collective shadow, so there's a notion of splitting as well. So it's more of an infantile response to split. So making people either all good and all bad. This is very black and white thinking. When I worked in child welfare with children who have behavioral issues, they could easily go from black and white thinking. Some of the work with that child is to help them get out of that thinking. Within the family unit, there is the projection of black and white thinking splitting, and roles are assigned and co-created in some sense. But basically with the notion of the scapegoat or the black sheep, they're the ones that embrace in some sense the family shadow. Part of the journey is for the scapegoat or the black sheep to no longer participate in the shadow of the family. Again, can understand from a young age, these children often have maybe some creativity, can have some curiosity, but for whatever reason they're chosen and unconsciously play the shadow out in the family, so they embrace that shadow to survive. So they might lean into being a bit odd or weird, because especially if your parents, the ones you look up to, are telling you that you're this way, you obviously have influence, and parents have authority over the child. As that child develops and individuates and becomes their own, especially as an adult, then those roles no longer serve. A lot of my clients see that because the family is dysfunctional, they continue to assign or split that person in terms of, so as that adult child, or he's in maybe their 20s or 30s, they develop and become their own person and develop their own interests and career and family. The family continues to assign the role that the child is to be a scapegoat or as a black sheep. So the family that's dysfunctional will continue to double down on the collective shadow, whereas the scapegoat or the black sheep often pointing out the shadow, understanding, I think first one has to own their own shadow. So there's kind of two aspects to this, because again, the original role within the scapegoat is to identify with the collective shadow of the family and take it on as its own. But through individuation, and that's, you can understand, entirely devastating for a child. Not to say that one's a child anymore, but obviously to some degree they went through that experience from a young age, and then they're also holding on to that likely. And so that's part of the work. But in order to get free from the notion that you're taking on the ownership of the collective unconscious or the shadow of the family, is to also then first, the scapegoat and the black sheep has to integrate their own shadow. They're learning to acknowledge where they're at fault, but they realize that obviously what the family is saying about them doesn't match up with reality. So unless they're willing to have cognitive dissonance and subjugate themselves to the family and to what Bowen would talk about as the collective ego mass, or within Carl Jung would be just a notion of resisting individuation. I think that's also a common pattern that people often value development or just psychology and this kind of thing, so growing. And they find themselves in a family unit that continues not to grow in some sense, and they continue to double down on the collective shadow and projection of them as the scapegoat. So they get to a point where they try a lot of times all these different ways to communicate with the family, thinking that if you keep going back to the well, that eventually they'll understand. But sometimes, often, families don't, these families especially, right? Yeah, it's not about you communicating better, but if you've integrated your own shadow, you've made the discernment between that the family shadow is not your own, that the narrative they tell you or others about you is not accurate. It's them not taking ownership or responsibility of their own psyche. And the scapegoat and the black sheep threatens the equilibrium and the homeostasis of the emotional unit of the family. Within a dysfunctional family, these roles might play out to some degree, and even within a more healthier dynamic, but there wouldn't be such a splitting, and there would be some collective ownership from the whole family, not infantile defenses from the parents. The hierarchy wouldn't be upside down. As the adult child grows and becomes individuated, if the family is dysfunctional or it's a narcissistic family in the sense that either one or two of the parents are narcissistic and perhaps the siblings play into that, then the scapegoat will threaten that equilibrium. They'll be seen as a difficult one and projected upon, and there'll usually be the whole smear campaign. But what you can do, though, within that is go silent. I never encourage no contact, but consider the video by Sam Vatkin about signs your family is mentally unwell. There's at least 6, he says. You should go no contact. Check out that video. If you've embraced the fact that you're individuating to ensure that your own development, you need to go no contact. Survive, even if it's the most loving response. It's not out of, I think usually when this first happens, there can be a lot of resentment and anger, and especially when there's a smear campaign or the family's trying to paint you a certain way. It's natural for one to defend themselves in their name, or just seek revenge, some form of retribution or justice. But knowing that feeds the cycle too, and is only continuing the pattern of dysfunction. So in some sense, that's why the scapegoat or black sheep is essentially the only one that really can change in some sense. But it provides a path for others, should others in the family become healthier or begin to differentiate more. And this could be later on, like nieces and nephews. So it's perhaps the case the family of origin continues their pattern and they're doubling down of you as the scapegoat and projection of the collective shadow of the family. But you're basically providing a path or a way in which you're differentiating, and you do that through starting your own family. It doesn't mean you have to start your own family, but living on your own accord, setting up the lifestyle you want. You're doing it for your own sake, right? In family therapy, there's a lack of differentiation. Even if you go no contact and you've accepted that you're the scapegoat, I think that there's still a lot of work, consideration, self-reflection to do. Just in the sense that, according to Bowen, there's an emotional cutoff as one of his principles. You could be emotionally cut off from your family, but your family's in you in some sense. Perhaps they have a very critical mother talking about order and structure with her family. She has some sense, this like notion of this interject perhaps in her own self still, where she has like the inner, so the interject of her mom, obviously within her own part of herself, basically telling her that she's not perfect, and that we talked about order and chaos. Sometimes more narcissistic individuals seem to seek after order, like extreme order, where everything's pristine, to give the illusion that they're perfect or superior. And yeah, it's also knowing that even if you go emotional cutoff with your family, there's a notion that they could still be interjects within oneself. That's learning with internal family systems, the notion of parts. So it could be the inner critic. And all these parts, they have some role to play. And that's the case too, where there's a discernment to make. Your family might have given you a lot, helped you with maintaining, getting you to school maybe, and doing the basic things that a family would do. And so it's not like you have to like praise them for that, but I think it's like making that discernment where even when there could have been good times, but then that doesn't discount all the times where the family was dysfunctional and unhealthy towards you, and all the psychological turmoil and abuse they put you through for years. So that's why it can be tricky, especially if you've been gaslit. The family narrative, the collective ego mass of the family, I believe, want to often convince you that, like, they want to say that you're being difficult. That's what the scapegoat or black sheep has to embrace from a young age, is that they're difficult or they're too much or they're the crazy one. They've had to drop a lot of these projections from the family. And this can be incredibly difficult, even one parent or a sibling. Sometimes, often in these families too, is there can be unhealthy civil rivalry. So a lot of sibling competition. In any family, there's a level of competition, but it's when it's done with such resentment, especially from the sibling, that they resent you for almost being alive. So it's a different level. You'll realize that your parents made conditions to create competitions. They almost enjoyed seeing siblings fight for their attention and energy. You find this with siblings, have a good time with your mom or something. Let's say you go on vacation with them, and then you hear from it like the next, like a year or so, or a few months after, how, oh, I noticed dad was saying this about you and saying that you guys had a great time. There's a jealousy. But then they just undermining of you just for the fact that you had a positive time. And so that's interesting, and just that misery likes company. And when you think about the narcissist or ego development, you just realize that like they're coming from a lower stage, more into their child self, or haven't individuated. This isn't to be better than them. I think that's also a risk. Even if you're a scapegoat or a black sheep, there's a lot of literature online about being you're a very sensitive person, an empath. And it's not to say I'm not against that, but I just think that we should be careful what we interpret and how we conclude about ourselves. Because I think we all want to be special or create certain narratives. And yeah, nothing's wrong with defining yourself as an empath. It's just that we all have a shadow too. Even if you went through this journey, I think that it's like owning your own shadow and knowing, and there's also the notion when you've been on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse. So particularly I'm thinking of a romantic situation where you've been exposed to that person for many years. So there's a notion that you were in the shared fantasy. And you can also think about that, I think, within a family of origin, that in some sense you were in a shared fantasy within the family unit. So you were to subjugate to the superego in some sense, or to what the narcissistic parent wanted, and they had to be in control in terms of what's considered the agenda or the narrative of the family. And so you put risk at that, maybe even just by being yourself, maybe being somewhat of a truth speaker and someone who was just saying the way it was. And so that's Carl Jung, right, had a patient, and she was saying that. I'm pointing out the obvious. Basically, the patient or the client was saying to Jung, and my family's attacking me and making me out to be the bad one. And so that's the interesting part, because it's like, at some level, you're thinking, I'm just saying the obvious. And let's say dad has a drinking issue. And so within that family, sometimes the mom perhaps is the enabler, and the siblings also go along. And so it could be the black sheep, a scapegoat that names the obvious. But because that questions, like the family wants to remain within the equilibrium or the status quo, so your consciousness and awareness threatens the family unit. I think we all know this, but the point is post no contact. If you go no contact, I think it's just, owning your own shadow and continue to develop yourself, knowing that there's no free lunch, as they say, and then the fact that is that you've been on the receiving end of these people for so long, and the shared fantasy. There's also the notion that you could have developed certain narcissistic traits or qualities. It's important to know that. And it's often the case sometimes my clients who have been, especially within a romantic relationship, they find themselves like, maybe it's at times feeling like they are superior, or just reenacting certain narcissistic qualities. And say that's why the narcissist wants us to be like them. And that's the kind of the in some sense the way you win, or the revenge. Not to say that there's ever really revenge with a narcissist, but just the way that you move on and grow is through going no contact and living in defiance of them and the dysfunctional family. That's the point of this video. When you go no contact with a dysfunctional narcissistic family, there's an emotional cutoff. But that doesn't mean your journey ends. It's a challenging journey. But part of that too is just like embracing the traits perhaps that you've developed that might be considered more narcissistic, or owning your own shadow, but then also making discernment between what's your shadow and then what's the family shadow. And then obviously no longer taking on the role of the collective shadow. In this video, I covered different aspects of the family. I was using a lot of Carl Jung and some of his approach in terms of understanding the notion of shadow and how the role of the scapegoat or black sheep of the family is co-created, but early on the family projected the notion of the collective unconscious, and how as an aspect of that the family can, especially if it's an unconscious family, can reenact a lot of those archetypes, not often being aware of them. And so it's, in some sense, the family is the theater of one's life growing up. People play these roles, and the black sheep is often, so the child could play into that part and then thinking it's their own. But as they develop and grow into and individuate, they learn that the collective projection of the family isn't something that they want to participate in anymore. And because they know who they are, and that's a threat to the equilibrium and individuation, they have to choose that over essentially the lie or the projection of the family. Because as we know, what is not our own isn't ours to take responsibility. In terms of family systems, it can be helpful. Like, I think sometimes hear of family constellations. So I think it's intuitive, we know this, right? But every family has a hierarchy. And if that hierarchy is not being honored, or there's some dysfunction in it, like either the child's being parentified or there's emotional incest, so the notion that the parents are confining overly into the child. And if that's the case, then family constellations just points out about healing statements and about speaking to those truths so that you're no longer a victim to them or having them as burdens, essentially. Yeah, I think it's important to recognize those. And so it could be helpful also to draw out a genogram. So that's like a collective or a map of the family in terms of the in-laws and the family of origin. And you usually go 3 generations back, but that can be helpful to draw some patterns in terms of, particularly if there was a notion of the shadow coming down throughout decades and centuries. So if, let's say, there's alcoholism in the family, that can be passed down through the generations. So in some sense, when the scapegoat, you can also understand that role likely played itself out already within your lineage or your heritage. And so by you stopping it, you're doing essential work for future generations. So there's a journey or a path for them, not only an individual journey, but it's also a collective journey in some sense, that the more people become individuated, the better, obviously. And Carl Jung spoke about this, and that's essentially the goal of psychology, right? So anyway, it's about being healthier, more differentiated as individuals, and within being a scapegoat, and it's also probably having a gut check around people you're around and who you're with to ensure that you have your best interests at heart.